Hello and welcome to the 48th edition of the GreenWave podcast by Synergy International. I'm SYNI, your host, and today's topic is about the dangers of being confidently wrong in a wetter world. We're weaving together events this week that point to such a perilous outcome. No prizes for all of us that knew COP30 was always likely to be a bust. We'll provide a brief discussion of this latest edition of a COP flop. The briefer, the better. Yet the political clown show in Belém dovetails with extraordinary news about supercomputer-enhanced climate forecasting and demonstrates the malevolence of those framing the current climate debate with ignorant overconfidence. Picture the future as a kind of mural. For the past few decades, climate science has painted that mural with a fairly broad brush. You could see the overall pattern very clearly. A warmer planet, rising seas, shifting rainfall, more extremes. It was like standing back from an impressionist painting. At a distance, the image is obvious. Once you walk closer and start asking where the floodwater will actually go, which valley, which neighbourhood, which port, the brushstrokes become too coarse. The reason is simple. Traditional global climate models chop the atmosphere into grid boxes about 100 kilometres across. A grid cell might run from Lisbon to well into central Portugal, or cover half of the Gulf of Mexico. Within each box, the model represents clouds, storms, and turbulence through statistical tricks called parameterizations. These tricks work reasonably well for smooth changes, such as global average temperature. They work much less well once you care about thunderstorms that chain together or narrow rivers of moist air that release a month of rain in 2 days. Over the past 5 years, a team of scientists has tried to repaint the mural with much finer pixels. Their experiment is called mesoclip. Instead of 100-kilometre cells, the atmosphere drops to about 25 kilometres. The top layer of the ocean goes down to around 10 kilometres. The world becomes more like a modern weather forecast, where you can resolve a storm system in detail rather than smudge it across an entire coastline. This is not a small upgrade. The team took a leaner version of a well-known Earth system model and cranked the resolution up, then ran it continuously from the year 1900 all the way out to 75 years into the future. They did this not once, but many times, under several greenhouse gas scenarios, nudging the starting conditions so that natural variability could express itself. Taken together, these simulations represent roughly 4,500 years of virtual climate. They consumed about 900 days of supercomputer time and generated on the order of 6 petabytes of data. That is enough digital storage to hold roughly the text of every book in a large research library many times over, or hundreds of thousands of hours of HD video. The payoff comes when you compare this high-resolution world to what has happened in the past century. The mesoclip runs reproduce the evolution of air temperature and ocean temperature with a fidelity that earlier model generations struggled to reach. Cold tongues of upwelling water emerge in the right places. Eddies swirl along western boundary currents in a way that looks very familiar to oceanographers who stare at satellite images. The statistics of extreme rainfall match the observed present far more closely. The new model hits the headline numbers and gets the underlying physics right. That gives the team more confidence when they turn the telescope around and point it toward the future. What they see there is not just a warmer climate. It is a wetter and more turbulent one, in ways that matter for real assets and real communities. Under a pessimistic scenario in which carbon emissions keep growing for most of the century and only peak near 2080, mesoclip projects that daily extreme rainfall over land increases by something like 37% by 2010. That is not a small change in the tails of the distribution. Even an apparently modest shift in the statistics of extremes means a completely different lived reality. Infrastructure designed around what used to be a 1 in 100 year deluge suddenly finds itself tested every decade or so. Insurance models that once treated certain compound events as almost impossible start to encounter them on a timescale that fits into a single career. There is a familiar soundbite which says that as air warms, it can hold more water vapor, so rainfall intensifies. That is true, and it explains part of the story. Mesoclip suggests that the more important action rests in the pattern of winds and the way storms organize themselves. In the higher resolution world, thunderstorms do not simply pop up and vanish in isolation. They line up into chains hundreds of kilometers long, feeding off the moisture flows that the coarse grid mostly smeared away. These organized systems drive many of the extreme rainfall events in the simulations. The old models did not really know how to create them. The same goes for the planetary plumbing that delivers water to land. Mesoclip resolves hurricanes in much greater detail and draws the long arcs of atmospheric rivers that run from the tropics to mid-latitude coastlines. Along the Gulf Coast of the United States and along coastal California, the model sees more frequent and intense downpours than older model generations had suggested. For regions that already face lethal combinations of storm surge, river flooding, and aging infrastructure, this is a different threat envelope. At the same time, the new model sheds light on parts of the ocean system that have puzzled scientists for years. In the Southern Ocean and parts of the Eastern Pacific, observations have recorded a patch of cooling in recent decades that sits awkwardly in a world that is warming overall. Several runs of Mesoclip reproduce this feature. They point toward a link with the Antarctic ozone hole. By cooling the stratosphere and strengthening the westerly winds around the Southern Ocean, the ozone hole seems to encourage upwelling of colder deep water, which then spreads and can influence the tropics. It is a subtle chain of causation, one that lower resolution models simply could not capture properly. The Arctic story also sharpens. The model renders the flow of relatively warm water through the Bering Strait between the Pacific and Arctic Oceans with more realism. That warm inflow helps explain the pace of Arctic amplification and sea ice retreat. Finally, the Atlantic overturning circulation, the huge conveyor that carries warm water northward and cold water back into the depths, appears more resilient in Mesoclip than in some prior models that tended toward dramatic collapse. The circulation still changes. The message is that the nightmare storyline of an abrupt shutdown soon is less supported once the physics is handled with more care. So the physical mural is coming into focus. The question then becomes who is prepared to look at it and understand what it means. This is where a second line of research enters, one that does not live in climate labs, but in behavioural science. A group of researchers set out to understand the relationship between knowledge, confidence, and opposition to expert consensus. They wanted to answer a simple question. When people loudly reject the scientific mainstream on topics such as vaccination, nuclear power, or climate, how much do they actually know about basic science, and how confident are they in that knowledge? Rather than quizzing people on controversial topics directly, they gave respondents a short test of uncontroversial scientific questions. Statements such as, "The centre of the Earth is very hot." Yes. The continents have been moving for millions of years. Yes. Oxygen in the air mostly comes from plants. Yes. Antibiotics kill viruses as well as bacteria. No. All insects have 8 legs. No. All radioactivity is man-made. No. Men and women normally have the same number of chromosomes. Yes. Lasers work by focusing sound waves. No. Almost all food energy for living things ultimately comes from sunlight. Yes. Electrons are smaller than atoms? Yes. At the same time, respondents reported how confident they felt about their answers. In addition, they stated their views on topics where an expert consensus exists and has become politically charged, such as vaccines and climate change. In some cases, they were even offered bets on their quiz answers, with real money at stake. Once the researchers pulled the data together, a pattern emerged. The people who were most opposed to expert consensus on those controversial topics turned out to be the ones who did worst on the basic science quiz. They scored lower on objective knowledge, yet they expressed the highest subjective confidence. They sincerely believed that they understood the issues better than others. When they took the bets, they lost more money. This was not mere bravado for social media, it was genuine overconfidence. There is a line attached to this work which says that a bet is a tax on nonsense. In that sense, the study functions like a revenue office for misplaced certainty. The key lesson is that a simple knowledge deficit approach to communication does not work well in this part of the population. The people most aggressively rejecting expert views are often the least equipped with basic facts and the least open to reconsidering their position. They do not lack information, they lack an accurate sense of their own limits. Once you bring that result back into the climate arena, the tension becomes obvious. Global models are moving toward much higher resolution and are delivering more complex and, in some respects, more alarming insights about the hydrological future. Yet, a vocal slice of the public debate is dominated by individuals who may struggle with elementary questions about atoms, light, and microbes, while feeling entirely confident in dismissing coupled ocean atmosphere simulations that run for decades on some of the most powerful computers on Earth. That mismatch would be amusing if it did not feed into real politics. For better or worse, climate policy has a main stage where global consensus is supposed to be hammered out. It is the annual conference of the parties, the COP process. In theory, this is the place where governments absorb the latest scientific insights and translate them into shared commitments. In practice, as seen in the recent meeting in Belém, COP30 made very clear the process is straining. This latest COP will be remembered as one of the most divisive in 3 decades of talks. Many countries arrived in Belém hoping for clear language on the future of fossil fuels, some kind of agreed pathway to move away from coal, oil, and gas. Many others, particularly major producers, arrived determined to prevent precisely that outcome. The gap between the two groups never truly closed. Brazil found itself at the centre of this drama. On the one hand, President Lula wanted this meeting to deliver something close to a roadmap away from fossils, a signal to the world that the era of unabated extraction is ending. On the other hand, the Brazilian diplomat chairing the conference was focused on preserving consensus. He understood that forcing explicit fossil language onto the formal agenda risked blowing up the talks altogether. His instinct was to underplay the fight in the official text to keep the process alive. During the first days, some careful phrases in the draft decisions hinted at possible roadmaps. Those hints did not survive. As negotiators dug in, references that looked even vaguely like a plan for phasing down fossil fuels were stripped out. Countries such as Colombia, the European Union, and a broad group of about 80 states tried to craft language that would at least acknowledge a future step away from coal, oil, and gas. Producers resisted at every turn. To bridge the gap, the presidency convened group discussions in the Brazilian spirit of mutirão, bringing different camps together to search for compromise. The exercise revealed just how deep the fault lines now run. Delegates from some Arab countries refused to join huddles that included governments calling for pathways away from fossil energy. European negotiators who pushed for stronger language were met with blunt responses. One major producer reportedly reminded them that energy policy is made in its capital, not in Brussels. For a while, the talks seemed on the brink of collapse. In the end, Brazil offered a way to save face. There would be roadmaps on deforestation and on fossils, but they would sit outside the formal COP decisions. They could be applauded in the plenary hall while remaining vague in legal status. Let's call it what it is, another in a series of cop-outs. The European Union did not have a comfortable meeting. On the adaptation finance front, it found itself cornered. Early drafts of the text contained a call to triple funding for climate adaptation. The wording was imprecise enough that the EU did not initially block it. The word tripling remained in the document. Later, when Europe tried to use finance as leverage to gather support for a fossil roadmap, the bargaining chip had already been given away. The best they achieved was to stretch the timetable for tripling out from 2030 to 2035. Observers noted that this was more evidence of a shifting balance of power, with coalitions of emerging economies asserting themselves and Europe retreating into a more defensive posture. Underneath that diplomatic guerrilla theatre, a more existential question about the COP process itself gained volume. Does this format still work? We say absolutely no. Is it useful to fly thousands of delegates, lobbyists and activists around the world to sit in vast air-conditioned structures and argue about the placement of commas in text that few citizens will ever read? Is it wise that key discussions about the future energy system take place at 3 a.m. among people who have not slept properly in days and who are balancing domestic political instructions with the fog of exhaustion? Enough. We can all acknowledge that the COP machinery achieved something historic when it delivered the Paris Agreement. That was a decade ago. Since then, climate policy has increasingly migrated into other arenas. Trade, industrial strategy, and finance regulation now carry much of the real weight. In Belém, trade arrived properly on the climate stage. The European Carbon Border Adjustment Measure became a central concern for several of the largest trading nations. For them, a levy on the carbon content of steel, cement, fertilizer, and other goods that cross into the European market looked like unilateral protectionism. For the EU, it looked like a logical extension of a system where domestic producers already pay for emissions. They argued that other countries were free to impose their own carbon prices instead and keep the revenue. Economists tend to view such measures as an efficient way to push the global system away from high-carbon products, since higher prices on pollution encourage substitution toward cleaner options. For households and firms, it means some goods become more expensive. For diplomats in Belém, it became a source of tension. In true COP style, the immediate resolution was to postpone the real fight. The final text launched an ongoing dialogue on trade for future climate talks, with a promise to involve institutions such as the World Trade Organization. Translation: the hard bargaining over climate and competitiveness will now take place in venues that were originally designed to manage tariffs and market access, not to negotiate emissions budgets. Meanwhile, the two largest emitters continued their complex snake-mating dance. The United States, under its current leadership, did what it could to undermine the gathering, and it basically succeeded. The absence of any official US delegation emboldened countries which prefer a slow pace of change. Russia played a more visible role in blocking references to fossil roadmaps. Saudi Arabia and other major exporters defended their interests robustly. China kept a noticeably low public profile in the political theatre, while focusing its energy on what one might call the real economy. Rather than making headlines in the plenary, it concentrated on deepening its position in the supply chains for solar power and other clean technologies that are now often the cheapest sources of new energy. The result of all this is a very uncomfortable juxtaposition. On the scientific side, we have moved into an era where the models are detailed enough to show the fine grain of storms and currents, and where the best physics indicates a future with more intense rainfall, more complex circulation shifts, and persistent warming, even if some of the more extreme storylines, such as an imminent collapse of the Atlantic circulation, are less likely. In the cognitive realm, we have more evidence that some of the most vocal opponents of this scientific picture are the ones least equipped to judge it, while feeling most certain they are right. In the political arena, we have a consensus process that struggles to agree even on the words needed to describe the role of fossil fuels, and that often pushes the real decisions into other bodies that deal in trade and finance, rather than climate per se. For investors, regulators, city planners, and communities, waiting for all three strands to line up neatly is not a realistic option. The storms will not pause while the plenary works through another late night. Rivers will not hold back because a commentator is convinced that basic science is a conspiracy. Capital that takes physical risk seriously is already moving. Reinsurers are recalibrating their models as new information on flood and storm risk arrives. Infrastructure funds are starting to price higher hydrological volatility into their valuations. Central banks and supervisors are experimenting with climate stress tests that incorporate more detailed physical scenarios. The role of high-resolution modelling in this context is not to deliver a single definitive forecast of the year 2070. It is to narrow the range of plausible futures, especially for the extremes that matter most. A 37% intensification in daily extreme rainfall on land is not the kind of number you treat as a footnote. It is a signal that the baseline used for design standards, insurance products, and sovereign risk may be too comfortable. When models that are demonstrably better at reproducing the past tell you that the future is wetter and more violent, the rational response is to adjust. That adjustment will not be helped by voices that shout down expertise while failing basic quizzes on the structure of matter and the nature of light. It may be helped by institutions that recognise the limits of the bad cop format and are willing to complement it with more targeted clubs, trade arrangements, and finance tools that reflect where power now lies. It will certainly be helped by a more honest conversation about physical risk, which accepts that uncertainty often means reality will land near the rough edge of the possible, not the cosy middle. As you listen to this, somewhere, a supercomputer is probably chewing through another enormous climate run. Somewhere else, a negotiator is staring at a late draft full of square brackets and politely aggressive comments. Somewhere else again, a commentator is preparing a confident monologue on why all of this is overblown. The physics does not particularly care. Water vapour will condense into clouds, winds will shape storms, oceans will store and move heat, and gravity will make sure that whatever falls from the sky eventually finds its way downhill. That is the world we must live in and invest in. A world in which the mural is now sharp enough to see the cracks and puddles in the street, even if the people arguing about it are still caught up in old habits. Well, that is a wrap on our 48th GreenWave podcast episode. We truly appreciate you sharing your time. Finding us is easy on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Podbean, Spotify, iHeart, Podchaser, Boomplay, and Player FM. Love the pod, follow the pod, and share it with friends. You can even leave a 5-star review. If you have missed any of our LinkedIn posts or the GreenWave Gazette, you can always catch us on LinkedIn, X, Facebook, Instagram, or visit synergy-international.net. Our poster contest was launched on the website and GreenWave Gazette this week, so check it out and sign up to win one of our original graphic art designs. We'll keep reflecting on the trends shaping sustainable finance and global policy. Until next time, keep riding the green wave of sustainability.